The courthouse stood tall and intimidating on that chilly Monday morning. People rushed in and out, some with hope in their eyes, others with worry. Among them was a young man named Amir, just 19 years old, with dark curly hair and eyes that showed both fear and determination. He wore his only good outfit, a slightly oversized blue button-up shirt tucked into khaki pants that had been ironed 3 times that morning. Amir's hands shook as he checked his watch. He was early, but his heart was already racing. Unlike the other people in court that day, he had no lawyer by his side. He simply couldn't afford one, not with the money he made from his 2 part-time jobs that barely covered his family's rent and his school fees. Case number 47 called out the court clerk in a bored voice. Traffic violation, speeding in a school zone. Amir stood up, clutching his folder of carefully prepared notes. He had spent weeks at the public library researching similar cases, learning legal terms, and practicing what he would say. This ticket would cost him over $300, money he desperately needed for his textbooks this semester. As he walked to the front of the courtroom, he could feel eyes on him. The room was filled with attorneys in expensive suits, all watching the young man who dared to represent himself. Judge Richard Wilson sat high on his bench, looking down at Amir with cold eyes. Everyone knew about Judge Wilson, his harsh sentences, his impatience with young people, and the whispers about how he treated people who looked like Amir differently. "State your name for the record," the judge said without looking up from his papers. "Amir Hassan, Your Honor," the young man replied, his voice steadier than he felt inside. "And you have no legal representation today?" Judge Wilson finally looked up, his eyebrows raised. "No, Your Honor. I'll be representing myself." A smirk appeared on the judge's face. "Well then, let's see what you've got, counselor." His tone made the last word sound like a joke. Amir took a deep breath and began presenting his case, using some of the legal terms he had studied. "Your Honor, I'd like to contest this citation on the grounds that the speed limit signage was obscured by overgrown foliage, constituting improper notice under State Traffic Code Section 114.7. The judge's laughter cut through the air like a knife. Several people in the courtroom joined in nervously. "Well, well, looks like we have a regular Supreme Court justice here." Judge Wilson's voice boomed. "Where'd you learn those fancy words, ton? Law and order reruns?" The courtroom erupted in uncomfortable laughter. "Perhaps you should stick to other pursuits more suited to your background," the judge added with a dismissive wave of his hand. The room fell silent. Everyone knew what he meant. The police officer who had issued the ticket looked down at his shoes, embarrassed. Amir's cheeks burned with humiliation. He had expected to be nervous, but not mocked. Not like this. For a moment, he considered giving up, paying the fine he couldn't afford, and walking away. But then he remembered his little sister watching him get dressed that morning, saying, "You look like a real lawyer, Amir." He thought about his mother who had worked double shifts all week. He thought about his dream of one day wearing a real suit in a real courtroom, fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. So instead of sitting down, Amir straightened his shoulders, looked the judge in the eye, and said calmly, "If you'll allow me to continue, Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence regarding the visibility of the speed limit sign." The judge's smirk faded slightly. He hadn't expected the young man to stand his ground. "Proceed," he said coldly, leaning back in his chair. This should be entertaining. What Judge Wilson didn't know, what nobody in that courtroom knew, was that Amir wasn't just any college student trying to avoid a traffic ticket. Behind those nervous eyes was a mind that could recite legal codes from memory. On the bus rides between his classes and his night shift at the gas station, Amir didn't scroll through social media like other teenagers. Instead, he read law books, thick, heavy volumes he couldn't afford to buy, so he photographed pages at the library to study later. At home, in the tiny apartment he shared with his mother and sister, Amir had created a study corner in the kitchen. Each night after his family went to sleep, he would sit there with a cup of cheap coffee, surrounded by printouts of court cases and legal notes written on the backs of old receipts and scrap paper. His journey into law began 3 years ago when his father died unexpectedly. The landlord tried to evict them illegally, knowing they couldn't afford a lawyer. 16-year-old Amir had stayed up 3 nights straight researching tenant rights. Against all odds, he managed to file the correct paperwork to keep a roof over his family's head. That victory changed something in him. He realized that knowledge of the law could protect people who had nobody else to protect them. Professor Chen at the community college had noticed Amu's talent immediately. "In 30 years of teaching, I've never seen a mind like yours," she had told him last semester, after he correctly predicted the outcome of a complex Supreme Court case that even legal experts had gotten wrong. "You think like the great justices," she had said. "You see patterns that others miss." But Professor Chen's praise couldn't pay the bills. When Amu's mother got sick last winter, he had to drop 2 classes to pick up more shifts. His dream of law school seemed to be slipping away with each passing month. None of this showed on Amu's face as he stood before Judge Wilson. Instead, he calmly opened his folder and pulled out a diagram of the intersection where he had received the ticket. "Your Honor, I've documented the visibility issues at this intersection from multiple angles," Amu said, his voice stronger now. "I've also compiled similar cases where citations were dismissed due to inadequate signage." Judge Wilson's eyebrows rose slightly. He had expected the young man to stumble or give up after being mocked. "Additionally," Amu continued, "I'd like to reference Thompson v. City Transportation Department, where the court found that overgrown vegetation blocking traffic signs constituted improper notice to drivers." The prosecutor, a young woman who had been half paying attention while checking her phone, suddenly looked up. Thompson was an obscure case from 5 years ago that rarely came up in traffic court. Amu handed copies of his documentation to the clerk. His hands were steady now. This was what he was born to do. The law made sense to him in a way that nothing else did, each statute connecting to others like stars forming constellations in his mind. Judge Wilson leafed through Amu's materials with growing interest. The diagrams were precise. The case citations were accurate. The legal arguments were structured exactly as they would be in a proper legal brief. The courtroom had grown completely silent. Even people waiting for their own cases had stopped whispering to watch what was happening. "And furthermore," Amu said, pulling out his final piece of evidence, "I've documented that 3 other drivers contested similar citations at this same intersection in the past month alone, suggesting a systemic issue rather than driver negligence." Judge Wilson set down the papers and studied Amu with new eyes. The mocking smile was gone from his face. "Where exactly did you learn to prepare a case like this, Mr. Hassan?" the judge asked, his tone different now, curious rather than condescending. Amu met the judge's gaze directly. "On my own, Your Honor," he replied simply. "The law belongs to all of us." "Let's continue with your argument, Mr. Hassan," Judge Wilson said, leaning forward with new interest. Amu nodded and pulled out his final exhibit. It was a set of photos showing the speed limit sign from a driver's perspective, taken at different times of day. The morning shots clearly showed how tree branches completely covered the sign until you were almost past it. "As you can see, Your Honor, by the time a driver can actually read the posted limit, they've already entered the school zone," Amu explained. He spoke clearly but without showing off. "I'd also like to point out that in Rivera v. Highway Department, the court ruled that municipalities have a duty to maintain clear visibility of traffic signs." The young prosecutor flipped frantically through her notes. She hadn't prepared for this level of defense for what should have been a routine traffic case. She stood up quickly. "Your Honor, while the defendant makes some interesting points, the fact remains that ignorance of speed limits is not a valid defense. The burden is on drivers to be aware of school zones." Amu waited patiently for her to finish. The courtroom was completely quiet now. Even people waiting for their own cases had stopped checking their phones to watch what was happening. "With respect," Amu responded, "the Supreme Court addressed this exact issue last year in Patel v. State Transportation Board. The ruling specifically stated that the presumption of awareness applies only when the municipality has fulfilled its obligation to provide adequate notice." The prosecutor's mouth opened slightly. Patel was such a recent and obscure case that she wasn't familiar with it. Judge Wilson raised his eyebrows, visibly impressed. "Are you certain about that ruling, Mr. Hassan?" the judge asked, his tone now genuinely curious rather than mocking. "Yes, Your Honor." The decision was unanimous, with Justice Lopez writing that obscured signage effectively nullifies the notice requirement upon which traffic enforcement depends. Judge Wilson tapped his pen against his desk. The young man standing before him wasn't just repeating memorized phrases, he understood the underlying principles. He was connecting cases and statutes in a way that showed real legal thinking. And how do you respond to the city's argument that you should have known it was a school zone based on the presence of the school itself? The judge asked, now genuinely testing Amir's legal reasoning. Amir didn't hesitate. The school building sits back 200 feet from the road, Your Honor, and there's a park between the street and the school property. Without proper signage, there's no reasonable way for a driver to know they've entered a reduced speed zone. This was addressed in Williams County v. Driver Association, where the court found that environmental cues alone do not constitute adequate notice of special speed restrictions. A small murmur went through the courtroom. The officer who had issued the ticket shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Judge Wilson set down his pen and leaned back. He looked at Amir for a long moment, seeing him properly for the first time, not as just another kid in his courtroom, but as someone with exceptional ability. "Counselor," he said to the prosecutor, "do you wish to present any counter-arguments to Mr. Hassan's citations?" The prosecutor hesitated. "I'd like to request a brief recess to review the cases mentioned, Your Honor." Judge Wilson nodded. "Very well. This court will take a 15-minute recess." He banged his gavel and stood up. As the judge walked toward his chambers, he found himself glancing back at Amir, who was carefully organizing his papers. Something about the young man's dignity in the face of mockery, combined with his surprising knowledge, had caught the judge off guard. For the first time in years, Judge Wilson felt something he hadn't expected to feel in his courtroom today: respect for someone he had initially dismissed, and shame for how quickly he had judged him. Inside his chambers, Judge Wilson paced back and forth. After 30 years on the bench, he prided himself on being able to size people up quickly. But he had clearly misjudged the young man in his courtroom today. "Lisa," he called to his clerk, "can you pull up any information we have on Amir Hassan?" Lisa nodded and began typing at her computer. "What exactly are you looking for, Your Honor?" The judge paused. "Anything. Educational background, previous court appearances, whatever we can legally access." As Lisa searched, Judge Wilson pulled out his personal tablet and looked up the Patel case Amir had mentioned. To his surprise, the young man had quoted it correctly, word for word. The ruling was exactly as he had described. "Your Honor," Lisa said, her eyes wide. "I think you should see this." She turned the screen toward him. It showed a legal blog focused on community law issues. The articles were thoughtful, well-researched pieces about housing rights, immigration procedures, and consumer protection. Most impressive were the detailed explanations of complex legal principles written in simple language that anyone could understand. "The blog is anonymous," Lisa explained, "but I found this comment on a legal forum where someone mentioned that the blogger helped them win their eviction case. They included an email that traces back to Amir Hassan." Judge Wilson sat down heavily in his chair. "What else?" Lisa clicked to another tab. "He's a student at City Community College. His pre-law professor, Dr. Chen, mentioned him in an academic paper about non-traditional legal education. She didn't use his name, but she described a student with his background." She read from the screen. "This student, despite working 2 jobs and supporting his family, displays legal reasoning skills comparable to top law school graduates. Without formal training, he has developed an intuitive understanding of constitutional principles that many practicing attorneys lack." Judge Wilson rubbed his forehead. The young man he had mocked and dismissed was secretly writing legal analyses that actual lawyers were reading. "There's more," Lisa continued. "Every Saturday morning, he volunteers at the community legal aid clinic. He can't give legal advice since he's not an attorney, but he helps people fill out forms and explains procedures to them." She pulled up a photo from the clinic's website showing Amir sitting at a table with an elderly couple, patiently explaining something on a document. "His LSAT practice scores are in the top percentile, according to Dr. Chen's notes," Lisa added. "He's been offered conditional scholarships to 3 law schools, but he hasn't accepted any of them yet." Judge Wilson stared at the photo of Amir helping the elderly couple. He thought about how the young man had spoken in his courtroom, not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence and respect, even after being humiliated. Why would someone with his abilities be working at a gas station instead of accepting those scholarships? he wondered aloud. Lisa scrolled down further on her screen. It seems his mother has been ill. According to college records, he requested emergency leave twice last year to care for her, and he has a younger sister who's still in high school. Judge Wilson walked to the window and looked out at the courthouse square. He thought about the assumptions he had made when Amir first walked into his courtroom, assumptions based on nothing but the young man's age and appearance. For the first time in many years, Judge Wilson felt deeply ashamed of himself. He thought about his own path to the bench, the advantages he'd had, the mentors who had opened doors for him, the family support that had made his education possible. How different might his life have been without those advantages? And how different might Amir's life be with just a few of them? The bailiff knocked on the door. "Your Honor, the 15 minutes are up." Judge Wilson took a deep breath and straightened his robes. He had made a terrible mistake today, but perhaps it wasn't too late to correct it. "I'll be right there," he said, his mind already working on what he needed to do next. When the court session resumed, everyone could feel something had changed. Judge Wilson walked into the courtroom with a different energy. His usual stern expression was replaced with something more thoughtful. "Before we continue with case number 47, the judge began, his voice uncharacteristically gentle, "I have something to say." The room fell silent. This was unusual. Judge Wilson rarely deviated from strict court procedure. "Mr. Hassan," he said, looking directly at Amir, "I owe you an apology." A wave of surprised whispers swept through the courtroom. In his 15 years on this bench, no one had ever heard Judge Wilson apologize to anyone. "My behavior earlier was unprofessional and disrespectful," the judge continued. "I made assumptions about you that were unfair and incorrect. As someone who is supposed to uphold justice, I failed to give you the basic respect every person deserves in this courtroom." Amir stood still, his folder clutched in his hands, clearly surprised by this unexpected turn. "Furthermore," Judge Wilson added, "having reviewed your legal arguments and the cases you've cited, I find your position to be well-reasoned and supported by precedent." The judge turned to the prosecutor. "Does the city wish to present any counter-arguments to Mr. Hassan's citations?" The young prosecutor stood up. "Your Honor, after reviewing the cases Mr. Hassan mentioned, particularly Patel v. State Transportation Board, the city agrees that the signage issue raises valid concerns. We would not object to dismissing the citation at this time." Judge Wilson nodded. "Case number 47 is hereby dismissed." He banged his gavel. "Mr. Hassan, I would appreciate it if you would meet me in my chambers after we conclude today's calendar." For the next hour, Amir sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, watching as Judge Wilson worked through the remaining cases. He noticed something different in how the judge spoke to each person who came before him, more patience, more careful listening. When court finally adjourned, Amir nervously approached the bailiff, who led him to the judge's chambers. Judge Wilson was sitting behind his desk, his robe now hanging on a coat rack in the corner. Without it, he seemed more human somehow, just a man in his 60s with reading glasses and tired eyes. "Please, sit down," the judge said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Amir sat, placing his wand folder on his lap. "What you did in my courtroom today," Judge Wilson began, "was remarkable. Not just your knowledge of the law, but your dignity in the face of my disrespect." The judge removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I've been on the bench for 15 years, Mr. Hassan. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing the people in front of me as individuals. I started making snap judgments based on, well, things that have nothing to do with who someone really is." He looked directly at Amir. "I want you to know that what happened today has forced me to examine some uncomfortable truths about myself and how I've been doing my job." Amir nodded but remained silent, unsure of what to say. "My clerk told me about your volunteer work at the legal aid clinic," the judge continued, "and about your academic achievements despite your personal challenges." Judge Wilson leaned forward. "I also know that you've been offered scholarships to law school but haven't been able to accept them because of family responsibilities." Amir shifted in his chair. "My mother has been sick," he explained simply, "and my sister is still in high school. I can't leave them right now." The judge nodded. "I understand family obligations, Mr. Hassan." "I truly do." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I was wrong about you today, and I suspect I've been wrong about many people who have come through my courtroom." Then, to Amir's complete surprise, Judge Wilson asked, "Would you consider allowing me to mentor you? I have connections at the law school, and we might be able to work out a situation that would accommodate your family needs." Amir looked at the judge with wide eyes, hardly believing what he was hearing. "Everyone needs a door opened for them at some point," Judge Wilson said quietly. "Even me." 6 months passed quickly. The early morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the courthouse library, where Amir now sat surrounded by law books. He was no longer wearing his old, oversized shirt. Instead, he had on a simple but well-fitting button-down that Judge Wilson had helped him buy for his law school interviews. "I think you've got the Miller case covered perfectly," Judge Wilson said, looking over Amir's notes. "Your analysis of the Fourth Amendment issue is better than what most practicing attorneys would come up with." Amir smiled. These early morning study sessions before the courthouse opened had become a regular part of his routine. 3 times a week, he would meet the judge at 6:30 a.m., and they would work through complex legal cases together. So much had changed since that day in traffic court. With Judge Wilson's help, Amir had secured a special scholarship at City Law School that allowed him to take evening classes while working part-time as a clerk at the courthouse. The flexible schedule meant he could still help care for his mother, whose health was slowly improving, and support his sister, who was now applying to colleges herself. "I have some news," Judge Wilson said, closing the heavy law book in front of him. "Dean Patel called me yesterday. They're expanding the evening program, and they want you to help develop a clinic for people who can't afford legal representation." Amir looked up in surprise. "Me? But I'm only in my first year." "Because of your experience at the Community Legal Aid Center," the judge explained. "Dean Patel was impressed by how you've been able to make legal concepts accessible to people without legal training." This wasn't the only change. Judge Wilson himself had transformed over these months. Other judges had noticed how differently he conducted his courtroom now, how he took time to listen to each person who came before him, regardless of their background or appearance. Word had spread about what happened that day with Amir. A local news reporter had caught wind of the story and asked to interview them both. "I was skeptical at first," Amir admitted, packing up his books. "I didn't know if I should trust your offer." Judge Wilson nodded. "You had every reason to be skeptical." "My mother thought I was crazy," Amir laughed. She said, "The judge who mocked you now wants to help you. Be careful." "Smart woman, your mother," the judge said with a smile. The story aired on the local news the following week. It was a simple piece about second chances and looking beyond first impressions. Nobody expected what happened next. The story went viral online. People shared it thousands of times. Comments poured in from across the country, some from judges who admitted they too had become jaded and prejudiced on the bench, others from young people inspired by Amir's determination. Phone calls began coming into the courthouse. Other judges wanted to know more about the mentorship program that Judge Wilson had established. Law schools reached out about creating more flexible programs for students with family responsibilities. Most surprising was the effect on the local legal community. 3 other judges in the district started their own mentorship programs. The courthouse began offering a monthly legal aid clinic where law students helped people with simple legal matters. "Did you see today's paper?" Judge Wilson asked, sliding the local newspaper across the table to Amir. The headline read, "Courthouse Program Helps 100 Families Navigate Legal System." Below it was a photo of Amir helping an elderly man fill out guardianship papers for his grandchildren. In the background, barely visible but definitely there, was Judge Wilson watching with what could only be described as pride. "We've come a long way from that traffic ticket," the judge said quietly. Amir nodded, looking at the photo. Sometimes the wrong turn leads you to the right place. Neither of them could have imagined that a moment of prejudice followed by the courage to admit a mistake would change not just their lives, but the lives of so many others. 3 years passed in a blur of late-night study sessions, court appearances, and family responsibilities. Today was the day Amir had been working toward since that fateful morning in traffic court. The law school auditorium buzzed with excitement. Families chatted while graduates adjusted their caps and gowns. In the third row sat a beaming middle-aged woman in a wheelchair, Amir's mother, healthier now than she had been in years. Beside her was Amay's sister, now a college student herself, proudly recording everything on her phone. And next to them sat Judge Wilson, looking different than he had 3 years ago. His hair had more gray now, and he had traded his usual stern expression for a genuine smile. He wasn't wearing his judicial robes today, just a simple suit with a blue tie that Amir had given him last Christmas. Amir Hassan called the dean, and the crowd erupted in applause as Amir walked across the stage. He wasn't just any graduate. He was graduating at the top of his class. His paper on making the legal system more accessible to ordinary people had won a national award. 3 prestigious law firms had already offered him positions. But Amir had other plans. After the ceremony, as friends and family mingled outside, Judge Wilson found Amir talking with a group of his classmates. "Congratulations, counselor," the judge said, shaking Amir's hand. "Thank you," Amir replied, "for everything." Those simple words carried the weight of all that had happened between them. From humiliation in a courtroom to this moment of triumph, their journey had changed them both. "Have you told your mother about your decision yet?" Judge Wilson asked. Amir nodded. "This morning." She cried a little, but she understands. Despite the lucrative offers from big firms, Amir had chosen to start a community legal center in his old neighborhood. He would be working with people who couldn't afford traditional legal help: immigrants, low-income families, the elderly. The same people he had been helping as a volunteer, but now as a licensed attorney. "Your office is ready whenever you are," the judge said. "The old meeting room at the courthouse has been renovated. It's not fancy, but it has everything you need to get started." Judge Wilson had not only helped secure funding for Amir's community legal center, he had also arranged for it to have space right in the courthouse where people could easily find it. That evening, after the celebrations had ended, Amir found himself back in the very courtroom where his journey had begun. The room was empty now, silent and dimly lit. He stood at the same spot where he had once trembled before a mocking judge. The door opened, and Judge Wilson walked in, his footsteps echoing in the empty room. "Feeling nostalgic?" the judge asked. Amir smiled. "Just thinking about how life can change in unexpected ways." Judge Wilson nodded. "You know, I'm retiring next month." "I heard," Amir said. "The courthouse won't be the same without you." "Well, I won't be far," the judge replied. "I've been asked to teach a course on judicial ethics at the law school, focusing specifically on recognizing and addressing bias on the bench." They both smiled at the irony. "We've come full circle," Amir said. "Not quite," the judge corrected him. "A circle just puts you back where you started. What we've done is more like a spiral. We keep coming around to the same point, but always at a higher level." He gestured to the courtroom around them. "In a few years, you could be sitting up there yourself. Judge Hassan has a nice ring to it." Amir laughed. "One step at a time." The next morning, Amir opened the doors to his new legal center for the first time. The waiting room was already full of people clutching papers they didn't understand, facing problems that seemed insurmountable to them. As he welcomed the first client into his office, he noticed a framed newspaper article on his wall, one he hadn't put there himself. It showed a young man in an oversized shirt standing nervously in court. The headline read, "From Mocked to Mentor: How One Court Case Changed a Community." Amir smiled. It wasn't just his story anymore. It belonged to everyone who needed a second chance or someone who believed in them when nobody else did.